There you go, good to go.
Excellent. Thank you, Joseph. So hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second in our series of online talks, where we invite external literacy experts to share their knowledge and experiences with us. So my name is Dr. Astrid Bowen. I lead the professional learning development team here at Cymru Cymru, and I will be chairing the session today. So as a National Centre for Excellence, Cymru Cymru is committed to uplifting the best evidence that we have on all matters related to literacy development and to strengthening the connections between literacy research and literacy practices in school. So with that in mind, I'm very delighted to welcome our speaker today, who is a proper expert on these topics, Professor Sarah McGeown. So Sarah is a Professor of Literacy and co-director of the Literacy Lab at the University of Edinburgh. Her research utilises participatory approaches and research practice partnerships to better understand and enhance children and young people's reading experiences and their outcomes. And today she's going to be talking to us about supporting children and young people's reading enjoyment and engagement. It's an extremely important topic, one we're very interested in. I know that we're very excited to hear what Sarah has to present for us today, so I will hand over to her without further ado.
Well, thank you, Astrid, for that introduction. I will just get my slides. Perfect. Can you see these okay?
Yes, they look good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm keen for today to be as useful for everyone joining today as possible. So please do feel free to put any questions into the chat during the talk, and there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. But as Astrid said, today I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we've been doing around understanding and supporting children and young people's reading motivation, their enjoyment and their engagement as well. So just to give a little bit of an overview of the talk for today, I thought I'd focus very briefly, first of all, on the current context in which we find ourselves in. This is 2026, it's the National Year of Reading, and the National Year of Reading has been prompted in part by this decline that we're seeing in children and young people's reading enjoyment and engagement. And so I'm going to be sharing some of that data initially. I'm then going to move on to talk about some of the benefits associated with reading, but book reading in particular, specifically looking at some of the intellectual, educational, social and emotional benefits. I'll then move on to thinking about key principles to support children's motivation and engagement, what's often referred to as reading for pleasure. And lastly, there'll be an opportunity to share some reading, some reflections, and some resources as well. So starting off, first of all, with the current context. So the National Literacy Trust is an organisation that I've been working with for a number of years now. Since 2005, they've been tracking trends in children and young people's reading. So they have 20 years of data now, and I know their 2026 report will be coming out soon. But what you can see, based on the data here, is that there has been, since about 2016, quite a consistent evidence of decline in the percentage of children and young people aged 8 to 18 who say that they enjoy reading. But maybe what's interesting is when we look at this data and we split it in terms of differences between boys and girls, differences across primary level versus secondary level, and we compare what's happened, for example, in the last 20 years, what we can start to see is that the evidence of the decline in reading is actually evidence of decline among children. So teenagers have historically reported low levels of enjoyment and engagement in reading, and that continues to be the case. But what we saw 2 decades ago, and even a decade ago as well, is actually quite high levels of reading enjoyment and reading engagement among children. And so they are largely responsible for what we're seeing about this kind of this decline over the last 10 years or so. And so the research that I'm going to be sharing today is going to be looking at children and young people's reading. I'm happy to talk about similarities and differences in relation to both in the questions at the end, and I will touch on some of those during the talk too. I also thought it might be quite useful to look at national comparisons. So again, this is the same data source, the National Literacy Trust data from 2025, where they've broken it down based on geographic region. And what you can see in terms of the percentage of children and young people aged 8 to 18 who say they enjoy reading, it's actually quite low in Wales, for example, compared to other countries. Or other nations, and then looking again at the amount of reading daily in their free time, again, we're seeing quite low levels in Wales compared to to other geographic areas in the UK. So this is obviously something which will, I'm sure, be of kind of national interest, specifically looking at if there's different ways that we can use to encourage children and young people to read more and to be more engaged with the books that they're reading. So I thought it might be useful, first of all, to outline some of the benefits associated with book reading. And there's lots of different ways in which we can sort of structure this or think about this, but I've come to think of some of the benefits as being sort of intellectual and cognitive, some of the educational benefits, and then also some of the social and emotional benefits too. And I'm going to dig into these in a little bit more detail now. So just to say that when I share some of the research around these, what I'm often drawing upon are either sort of large-scale longitudinal studies, sometimes systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but I also want to sort of forefront children and young people's perspectives and experiences. And so I plan to include some of the quotes in terms of what they say in relation to these different benefits. So there's research, for example, to demonstrate that children who read more often have improved educational outcomes. Of course, reading is a skill that's needed in order to access many areas of the curriculum. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that those children and young people who report reading more also report better educational outcomes. We also know that the children who read more often also have better literacy skills. We see this in terms of their reading, their comprehension, and their spelling skills as well. And there's a reciprocal relationship between these things, of course, that children who read more have better reading skills, and as a result of better reading skills, may be more likely to read more too. Reading is obviously a language-based activity. It is simply the representation of language in written format. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the more that we read, the more opportunities there are to improve our language and our vocabulary skills as well. And actually Kate Nation's work, which was published a couple of years ago, looked at the properties of book language. So it was an analysis of the type of language that we get within books versus everyday spoken language. And what her work illustrated is that books expose us to a much richer and more diverse vocabulary than we would naturally experience within everyday spoken language. So there's opportunities for language development through reading books. And again, these are just some of the research that we've done with children and young people, where they're reflecting on the different ways in which book reading has supported their language or literacy skills. But beyond these sort of intellectual and educational benefits, reading can also support young people, children and young people themselves. So I've decided I'm going to focus next on this aspect of personal enrichment, that through reading there's an opportunity for children and young people to better understand themselves and develop a positive sense of self and sense of belonging. Some of the research around this has shown that this is particularly true for children and young people from with minority identities, where they perhaps see themselves reflected in what they read, or when they maybe see their experiences reflected in the books that they read as well. And this is because books often provide opportunities for readers to engage in personally meaningful content. We know that the teenage years are a particularly important period of identity development, as teenagers are trying to make sense of who they are and their place within the world. And in some of the research that we've done with teens, we've seen that to be particularly important in a resource, books being a resource in which they've used to develop and consolidate their identities, but also to improve their self-awareness, self-understanding, and as I've said, feeling less alone and reflecting on meaningful life events too. So there's a lot of opportunity for children and young people to see themselves, whether it's their lives, their experiences, or their identities reflected in what they read. And when these are represented in a positive way, this can really support feelings of personal enrichment. But beyond being able to better understand ourselves better, books can also give us a better understanding of others as well. And reading books has been thought to be seen as a kind of simulation of the social world, where we're able to get sort of an insight into characters' inner worlds, to be able to better understand things from other people's perspectives, and to understand why they maybe have the beliefs or the motives that they do. And again, there's been quite a lot of research, including some of our own, which has shown the potential for us to understand other people, whether it's characters who are similar to us or different to us, and the potential for books to support our empathy, both cognitive and affective empathy, and also to reduce prejudice towards others. But beyond the sort of personal enrichment and understanding others, book reading can also develop our knowledge and understanding of the world around us. And it can also expand our life experiences. That is, give us insight into people, places, settings, environments that we would never experience otherwise. And so through both fiction and non-fiction, books can inspire children and young people's learning. It can broaden their minds, and it can also allow them opportunities to explore topics and issues which may be personally important or meaningful to them in a little bit more depth. And another area in which people are looking at the research around the benefits of reading are looking at the relationship between reading and well-being. And there have been a number of large-scale quantitative studies suggesting that there is a statistically significant and positive, albeit weak, relationship between reading and well-being. And this is research which has been carried out not just in the UK, but also in the US and Australia as well. And what we're seeing, as I've said, is this kind of positive relationship, but it is quite weak. And this is because at a population-based level, we wouldn't necessarily expect reading to support well-being. We know from some of our qualitative research and other quantitative research too, that for some children and young people, reading can be stressful, it can be boring, it can be anxiety-provoking. Some people are completely indifferent to the idea of reading as well, like it's just not something that they care about. And so we shouldn't be arguing that reading can always support well-being, but also understanding for who and under what context and conditions reading can support well-being, in the same way to what extent it can support personal enrichment, understanding of others, etc., and trying to nurture those conditions under which it does that. And we've published a couple of papers in the last year trying to expand our understanding of the different ways in which reading can support well-being, looking at well-being not just in terms of positive emotions, but also in terms of thinking about connection and personal growth. And lastly, book reading can also connect us with other people as we share, discuss, and recommend books with friends, peers, or family. But books can also help to exemplify the types of relationships that we might want to have in our own life, and can help us to give examples of good friendships, for example. And so there's lots of different ways in which books can maybe support our connection with other people. Okay, so I've highlighted there just some of the benefits associated with reading books, and I've said that these tend to be sort of intellectual, cognitive, educational benefits, and sort of social and emotional benefits too. But I think it's important to highlight that these benefits from reading only come when children and young people are engaging with the books that they read. It is incorrect to say that all children and young people are getting these benefits from reading books. And what I want to talk about now is this concept of engagement and why that's so central to our understanding of positive experiences and outcomes when thinking about reading. So a couple of years ago, we published a paper, Reading Engagement Matters. This is with someone I work with in the US, Kristen Conradi-Smith, and based on a systematic review of reading engagement research that they'd carried out previously. Now, when we think about reading engagement, we tend to think about reading engagement as being synonymous with time spent reading, so behaviour engagement. But actually, it's more than just having a book in front of you that for the benefits of reading to accrue. We also need to be cognitively and emotionally engaged in the books that we're reading. And we need this engagement to happen in both individual and social reading practices. And so in order for the benefits of reading to be accrued, first of all, we need children and young people to be engaging in positive reading behaviours. And we know that there's a lot of research showing that the more time we spend reading, the better our reading skills, our language skills. We know that frequency of reading, duration of reading is important as well. And there's also been quite a lot of research looking at the benefits of different text types for some of these positive outcomes. And the research seems to be quite consistent that actually books, in terms of that sort of long form text, seem to be most important in terms of developing language literacy and educational outcomes. So behaviour engagement, helping children and young people find books that they're going to want to spend time with, reading is really important. But beyond that, we also need to think about cognitive engagement. I define cognitive engagement as cognitive effort and the implementation of cognitive strategies, for example, to support comprehension or inference skills to support empathy, for example. We know that reading is a cognitively effortful activity, whether you're a young child in the early stages of learning to read, or you're even an adult reader who's a fluent reader. We all know that reading can be quite cognitively effortful, and so we need to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to be giving children and young people books that they're going to want to read, that they're going to invest that cognitive effort, and that they're going to implement those cognitive strategies to support their comprehension. And these cognitive strategies may be things such as decoding unfamiliar words. It may be rereading in order to make sense of something that there may be misunderstanding within the text. It may be sort of actively drawing on background knowledge or personal experience in order to make sense of something. It may be drawing inferences in order to sort of empathize or to understand the character's intention better. And these cognitive strategies are something which need to be activated. And so we want children and young people to be motivated to want to put into place these cognitive strategies to support their comprehension and their overall depth of understanding and engagement. But beyond cognitive effort, we also want children and young people to be having positive affective experiences. That is, reading books which are personally enjoyable, meaningful, and engaging as well. We know that children who come to reading with a predisposition to feel sort of that it's stressful or quite anxiety provoking, it can be really hard to have a positive experience from reading in that way. And so really it's about helping children and young people to find texts where they are going to have those positive experiences, positive emotional experiences with the books that they read. And in some of the work that we've been doing, looking at the relationship between reading and well-being, we've started to identify a wide range of positive emotions that children and young people talk about in relation to their reading, but also that sometimes they can kind of enjoy quite negative or unsettling emotions as well, and that books can sometimes help them work through quite difficult things within their life. So affective experiences don't necessarily need to be positive, but they need to be internalized in some way among children and young people as being beneficial for their own personal growth. And then, of course, beyond the individual active reading, we know that we can extend and enhance children and young people's reading experiences and outcomes through positive social reading activities with others. And in this way, they are able to understand other people's perceptions and thoughts on books, in addition to getting recommendations from others to sort of support more reading behaviours too. So I would just like to stress once again that when I talk about all of these benefits associated with reading books, these benefits really do only accrue when children and young people are engaged with the books that they read. That is, are showing behavioral engagement, but also cognitive and positive affective engagement, and are also engaging individually and socially too. So from this, what I'd like to do now is move on to thinking about some sort of key principles to support and sustain all children and young people's motivation and engagement. I'd like to stress that this is based on a project which was funded by the Nuffield Foundation called Love to Read, which focused on supporting children's reading motivation and engagement. And I'm also drawing on some insights from a 3.5-year project, the Young People's Reading Project, looking at teenagers' perceptions of the motivators and barriers to their reading. And so I'm going to focus on these 6 principles now. And these 6 principles are really a way of summarizing what is quite a vast and complex body of research. So the reading motivation and engagement, or reading for pleasure research literature, is comprehensive, but it's also very diverse. We have researchers looking at this from very different disciplinary perspectives, utilizing very different methodological approaches. And so what I did with these 6 principles was to try and capture the complexity of this research literature and distill it into sort of key, distinct ideas that would be important to communicate with teachers. So what are the underlying principles to support motivation and engagement? So I'll go through each of these in turn with some suggestions for practice too. So the first principle is that of access. It's an absolute foundation that children and young people, they need to have regular and easy access to books or texts which reflect their personal interests, preferences, lives, experiences, abilities, and reading stamina as well. And it's important to recognise that within any school community or within any classroom, there's going to be wide variation in terms of children and young people's personal interests, their preferences, their abilities, but also their stamina, the length of text that they're able to read too. And so it's really important that as much as possible, the provision in school reflects the needs of these contemporary readers. What I would really encourage is children and young people's input into book or text provision, and to pay particular attention to children and young people who maybe don't have access to quality books or texts, that is, those that are aligned with their own reading needs. And this may be, for example, children who have difficulties with reading, language difficulties, attentional difficulties. It may be children from, it may be boys, it may be children from different minority identities as well. So just making sure that as much as possible, the provision of books within school reflects the interests of the community, and is not necessarily about quantity of text as well. It's not necessarily about having a lot, it's about the quality and that kind of curated quality of texts. The second principle is choice. It's the idea that children and young people need to have choice in relation to their reading, but actually recognising the fact that very often children and young people don't have the knowledge, skills or strategies in order to independently choose their own books. So we hear a lot about the importance of children and young people's agency and choice, but actually a lot of children and young people say that they just don't know how to choose books that they'd enjoy. And very often in schools, we will explicitly teach children the way to decode words, or we might explicitly teach them comprehension strategies, but we never actually explicitly teach them how to choose books. And so we need to empower children and young people with the types of knowledge, skills and strategies that they need to choose books that they will enjoy, both now, but also as their reading interests evolve over time as well. And we found that this is actually quite transformative when this is put into place within school. One of the things we do find is that children often take longer choosing books. They're more likely to swap books faster if they're not enjoying it. But teachers are noticing that actually children are much more engaged in the books that they're reading, and children report reading more outside of school because they're finally finding books that they like. Choice in book reading can be easier for more experienced readers, and so what I would encourage is additional support and more scaffolding perhaps for less experienced readers, and to organise books as much as possible, either within a school library or in a classroom reading space, organise books optimally in order to make choice as easy as possible. The next principle is that of time. It's based on the fact that research evidence shows that time spent reading is beneficial for sort of language and literacy development, but we know that children and young people really need environments conducive, and that's about having quality time and space to read at school, and to read books that they're enjoying, and then encouraging out of school reading practices too. So having that kind of routine quality time in school is good. Helping children and young people find books that they're enjoying in school is good, but then we also want to encourage out of school reading practices. And I think one of the things that I would stress most about time is that it's not about simply having a book in front of you. It's about making sure that you've got a book that you're engaged with in front of you during that time. That's what's important for the benefits of reading to be realised. The next principle is that of connection. It's the idea that children and young people need access to books, but also to reading activities which are personally meaningful to them. That is, connect with their lives, their identities, their experiences, but also perhaps their own goals for reading too. So we know there's a lot of research around at the moment around the importance of diversity and representation within children's books and young adult fiction as well. That is, children and young people seeing themselves and their identities reflected in what they read, whether this is the representation of racially minoritized characters, neurodivergent characters, LGBTQ communities, but also thinking about intersections between these as well. Being able to see yourself and your own identities and experiences reflected in what you read is really important. But so are your sort of goals and experiences that you want from books. So in the work that we've done with children and young people, they talk about books as offering lots of different types of experiences, opportunities to relax, to laugh, to spend time with fictional friends, to experience escapism, to pursue their interests. And so we want children and young people to connect with the type of experience that they're looking for from books as well. And different genres often allow that. Another thing to think about is reading promotion messaging and the fact that this should really align with children and young people's reading goals and ways of communicating. And this came from the research that we did with teenagers when trying to understand the motivators and barriers to their volitional reading. They said that reading, we need to be talking and communicating about reading in ways which are authentic and relatable to them. And based on this, I've become quite critical of the term reading for pleasure because it's actually completely disconnected from the types of language and ways that teenagers, at least, talk about their own reading. And so we're starting to do a lot more analysis of the types of language that children and young people are using when talking about their reading. So whenever we promote reading to children and young people, it needs to be done in ways that connect with them, with their ways of thinking about reading, and sort of more authentic and relatable messaging. So in terms of what this means for practice, just making sure that the book provision available within your school or public libraries reflects the lives, experiences and interests of readers, that you're developing children and young people's skills in book choice so that they can choose personally meaningful texts, but also supporting reflective reading practices as well, so that they're maybe more likely to make connections between text content and elements of themselves. And as I've already said, ensure reading promotion messaging connects with children and young people's goals, interests, and own ways of communicating. The next principle is social, and this is the idea that children and young people's reading experiences can be expanded by supporting social reading activities, but that these need to be inclusive. Children and young people need to be encouraged and allowed to contribute their thoughts and ideas and recommendations in ways which are accessible, enjoyable, and meaningful for them. And we also need to recognise, maybe particularly more for less experienced readers or more disengaged readers, that they maybe don't have the knowledge, skills, or confidence to engage in book talk. And so we need some explicit support with this as well. And so in terms of what this means for practice, support children and young people with the knowledge and skills that they need for book talk, but also encourage a sort of wider members of the community to get involved. So it's not simply about social reading activities within the sort of classroom context, but also within the wider school and also wider community too, and developing links between school and public libraries. And the final principle is that of success, is the idea that children and young people need a range of rich and diverse positive reading experiences. They need to be able to set personally meaningful goals for themselves and to be able to recognise their growing success as readers. And this is underpinned by some of the kind of theoretical frameworks of reading motivation, but also empirical work as well. And so it's important that we think about reading success in its broadest sense. So reading success isn't just about having good reading skills. It's also about being more confident choosing books that you like. It's about maybe trying out a new genre or discovering a new book series that you enjoy. Reading success can also include engaging in book talk or choosing to read more outside of school. So there are lots of different ways in which children and young people can develop as readers and be able to see their own success as readers too. So this is really about broadening their understanding of what it means to be a reader and what reading success looks like, and helping them to develop personally meaningful and achievable goals so that they can direct their own paths as readers. And ensuring that they're also getting praise in ways which is personalised and timely as well. So, sorry. So as I've said, I'm happy to share, well, I will share access to some of the research underpinning this, but these kind of key principles that we identified, this was part of the Love to Read project, and then we worked with teachers to think about how these principles can be embedded within practice, and I'll share this now. So in terms of reading, resources and reflections, just to say a lot of the work that we're doing at the Literacy Lab at the University of Edinburgh is often in research practice partnerships. So we work in collaboration with a lot of different literacy, library and education organisations, in addition in collaboration with teachers and other professionals as well. We find that a lot of the research that we do is just better and it's more educationally relevant and meaningful when we are working with professionals who really have that sort of insight that we as academic researchers don't necessarily have. But we're also very keen on using participatory approaches as well. So very often we are working closely with children or young people in our work, depending on the project, either through doing qualitative studies to amplify their voices and what their thoughts are about reading, or working alongside them as co-researchers to help us design the study or to interpret the findings as well. And these are just some of our papers from the last couple of years, and also just a couple of books which have recently come out. I'd also just like to highlight the Future of Books and Reading paper, which was published last year. So the Future of Books and Reading paper is really about setting out a positive narrative in terms of where we are at the moment. There's so much discussion about the decline in children and young people's reading. And so what we wanted to do was kind of set out key ideas to frame future thinking and discussion as well. So there's the ideas of enjoy, engage, empower, enrich, and expand. And within each of them, I've sort of summarised some of the research from both academic literature and grey literature. And then there's lots of contributions from individuals working from university-based researchers to those working in the literacy, library, education, festival, museum sectors as well, in terms of their thoughts in relation to each of these themes. Just to say, in terms of some of the resources that we have, we've got quite a lot of academic articles that we're continuing to publish, but we also write a lot of blog posts as well. We have summaries for teachers, a number of recorded talks too. If you're interested in anything that I've covered today, I would say that the main projects that I've drawn upon today are the Reading and Wellbeing Project, the Love to Read Primary Project, and the Young People's Reading Project. So if you'd like to look at any of those papers, you would find those on those web pages. Just to say some additional things that you might be interested in. So one is Love to Read. This was a project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, in which we worked with primary school teachers to co-create activities to embed these 6 research-informed principles in practice. The Nuffields are currently funding a randomised control trial of Love to Read in schools within England. And so we're hoping to get the results from this next year. The trial is just about to start just after the summer break. And just thinking about within your own context within Wales, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the Love Reading Project. So there's just a link to that there if you're interested in some of the work that's being carried out within your own context. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you for listening, and a huge thanks to our funders, to all the children and young people who are involved in the work that we do, but also to the literacy organisations and the teachers and professionals who really do contribute so much to the work that we do. And there's an opportunity now for questions, clarification, and discussion as well. So I will just stop sharing my slides.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. You've got some virtual clapping appearing for you. So as usual, I have plenty of questions I've jotted down along the way. If anybody has questions, pop them in the chat or just sort of pop your hand up and I'll call on you. But to get us started, I might as well start with a question that's probably on a lot of people's mind and on a lot of teachers and sort of parents' minds, which are, what are some of these factors in children's reading declining so much in recent years? And what do you think are some of the main contributors to that?
Yeah, I think like technology, I don't even know if I need to say it, it was so obvious that like technology and the increased use of screens and the dominance of screens within children and young people's lives. I think children aren't really socialised around books in the same way as they maybe were even like 5 years ago. And I think that sort of early socialisation around books and books being just part of your everyday life has certainly shifted. So I think that there's definitely something to say about the shifts in terms of our use of screens. But I would say as well, it's about the accessibility and relevance of books within children and young people's lives as well. So when teenagers talk about reading on their phones, they say it's with me all the time and it's personalized content that just pops up based on the things that I'm reading. And that's very different from necessarily going to a library or going to a bookshop and selecting a book. So I think the accessibility and that sort of personalized content is something to really think about. And so I think we do need to be working with children and young people and thinking about, well, how can we embed books more readily into their everyday lives? I think there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect between the books that are being written and printed now and the reading stamina that children and young people have. Very often teenagers are talking about books being too long, and no one wants to start a book and never finish it. And so I do think that there are implications for the publishing industry as well, in terms of kind of shorter form text types that really engage children and young people in reading too. So I think that there's a multitude of different factors, and I think that there's as well, one of the things that I would say is, when we talk about the relationship between reading and well-being, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes you need to be well enough in yourself in order to read, because reading is a cognitively effortful activity and requires time and some brain space. And I think with maybe, you know, higher numbers of children, young people maybe living in poverty or maybe living in quite stressful circumstances, again, that idea that they're going to pick up this cognitively effortful activities maybe less likely. So there's just a number of different factors, and they are sort of economic, social, publishing, you know, there's a multitude of different factors. And I think that the solution really is around kind of more multi-sector working and really listening more to children and young people and what they're telling us, rather than adults thinking about what it is that's needed. And I'm happy to expand on that if it's useful.
I think that's such a full answer. And like you say, there's so many factors feeding into it. I hadn't actually considered what you mentioned about well-being before. So I think that's really interesting, because obviously there has been a general decline in children, young people's sort of mental health and their sort of sense of well-being as well. So I hadn't considered until now that that might be somehow connected to the, you know, the types of texts, or the length of the texts, or you know, whatever they're engaging with.
Mm.
Um, because the accessibility issue is interesting, because, you know, screens are obviously a vehicle for text. You know, you can have thousands of ebooks at your fingertips, you know, and yet it sounds like to some extent there's a disengagement which it's fostering as well, which is quite interesting. um
Yeah, I think it's, I guess I've been thinking a lot about kind of like behavior change recently, and how the best way to change behaviors is really to embed reading, positive reading experiences within children and young people's everyday lives. And one of the easiest ways to do this, I think, is teenagers with their phones, and kind of starting with shorter, you know, high quality content and things as well. And I guess, I mean, a lot of my own work has focused on book reading in particular, but I am interested in kind of shorter form texts, which are maybe sort of engaging, empowering, or enriching for children and young people in other ways. So it's not to say it's not, doesn't always need to be books. We can actually be engaging with other different types of text, whether audiobooks, podcasts, whatever it might be. But it's about those kind of positively enriching and personally enriching reading experiences that are important. So those don't have to just be books, but it's about moving past the doom scrolling, or just the content that children and young people find themselves like orientating towards. And I know, even as myself, like, I find my own attention spans being eroded by technology. I have to really intentionally put my phone aside and read books as well. And this is me, someone who's talks about how important this is. So if I'm struggling with this, it's unsurprising that children and young people are experiencing this as well. They're less able to regulate themselves in the same way. So I think we really do need to be listening more to them, what they say the issues are, and providing, yeah, providing practices and based on this.
Absolutely. And I don't think you're alone there, Sarah. I think we're all experiencing this very strange but interesting sort of erosion of attention and everything with the way that modern technology is being. So I'll go to Jo in the chat, because I think she's referring to the patterns of
Yeah.
engagement here. So she asks, what happened in 2016? Why do you think it might have peaked then?
So I don't know. So that's the National Literacy Trust data set. So we'd have to ask Christina Clark what her interpretation is of that. But I would say that maybe over the last decade, we've seen an increase in the use of technology within our lives, particularly within children's lives as well, and a sort of move down not just among teenagers necessarily using tech, but children too. So I think that perhaps it's just been in the last decade there's been that increase, and that's maybe led to the sort of continual decline that we're seeing. But beyond that, I'll be honest, I haven't spent a lot of time speculating or thinking about that in a lot of detail. If anyone else in this call has any ideas, I'd be really interested to hear those.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, without, I guess, talking to the author, like you wouldn't really know, would you? But thanks, Joe, for your question. So I'll go to Estelle now
Yeah.
in the chat. Estelle is, I should point out, our reading motivation champion and reading and writing motivation champion on our professional learning team. So she's been doing a lot of work in this area, and I think drawing upon your work as well. So she says, "Hi Sarah, thank you for such an interesting and informative talk and for your work in this area more generally. I have a question about the role of extrinsic motivators, for example, rewards and competitions. The literature appears quite divided on the value of extrinsic motivators, particularly given concerns that they might undermine intrinsic motivation." So we'll start with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've actually captured that very well. So for those who maybe unfamiliar with the difference between the two, so intrinsic motivation is basically about developing that internal drive to want to read. So choosing to read because you enjoy reading, because you want to pursue your interest, because you want to spend time with fictional friends, whereas extrinsic motivators are reading for to comply with an external demand, whether that is to win a reward or a competition or to get praise from an external person. So the research literature is very, very consistent that intrinsic reading motivation, that internal desire to want to read, is what leads to positive reading practices and better reading outcomes. But in terms of extrinsic motivators, I think that you've touched on it just there, actually. I think that extrinsic motivators are okay as long as they don't undermine intrinsic motivation. And I think it's just about finding that balance between them. And I also think that some children can internalize extrinsic motivators too. In other words, maybe you are reading a lot in order to get a good grade, but it's not just for that grade, it's you've internalized the importance of getting a good grade for your own personal outcomes as well. So there's it's people set these two things apart as being, intrinsic's good and extrinsic's bad, but actually I think it is just about ensuring extrinsic doesn't undermine intrinsic and thinking about ways in which extrinsic can be internalized as well. And certainly some of the research that we see from children and young people, they have quite different perspectives about extrinsic motivators. Yeah. So for those children who tend to get, who are more likely to get medals and rewards, they quite like extrinsic motivators. But for children who say that they're always trying really hard and they're never getting any, that can actually be really demoralizing and really demotivating too. So I think it's really important that if these more visible rewards are being put in place, that they are not unintentionally demotivating children who maybe aren't necessarily getting those awards too. So it is complex, but I think making sure it doesn't undermine is important. And then the gaps between reading enjoyment and voluntary reading between boys and girls, if I think there's a particular explanation for that. I do have a bit of an explanation, and it's perhaps quite an unpopular one as well, but I'll share it anyway. So about a decade or so, I did some research looking at boys and girls and their gender identity and the extent to which they identified with traditional masculine and feminine traits, but also the extent to which they would transcend gender boundaries in terms of the books that they would read. Now, as adults, we would always say there's no such thing as books for boys and books for girls. But the truth is that's not how children see it. Like from a very young age, children are socialized into their gender. And so to come up to the age of 10 and be told there's no such thing as a book for a boy or a book for a girl, that they don't see it like that. And what we found in our research, this was a study with over 200 children aged 8 to 11, we found that girls are much more likely to transcend gender boundaries. That is, they're more likely to read books that look like they're for boys. But girls are also more likely to read gender neutral books, whereas boys won't transcend gender boundaries and are more likely to say gender neutral books are books for girls. And it was only the boys who identified with feminine traits that were more likely to read these books. So I never want to endorse gender stereotypes at all, but I think children are being socialized in such a way that they're seeing from a very young age that there are certain things that are for girls and for boys. And I would argue that when we're trying to get them to read, we should just give them the books that they want to read, while at the same time trying to stretch and challenge these stereotypes that are in place. So I think that's one of the issues. And I think very often when we think of these gender neutral books, we think that they're neutral, but actually that's not how boys are seeing them. And in primary schools, we maybe have quite a lot of female, like really brilliant female teachers as well, but who maybe aren't necessarily have the same knowledge of books that boys might want to read. And I'm sorry, that's maybe more controversial than I would like it to be, but I do actually think that that's playing a part in the role. Another thing that we see, and again, it's just a consistent finding, is that boys are more likely on average, so everything's on average, boys are more likely to read non-fiction, whereas girls are more likely to read fiction. But when we look at the kind of text that teachers are reading aloud, very often it's the class text is a fiction book and not a non-fiction book. So we want to think about the presence of different text types and within children's reading experiences as well as a whole class. So yeah, I suppose that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, no, super interesting to think about. There's this massive socialization element, and actually, you're right, it's obviously a difficult subject, so hence people wouldn't necessarily talk about it a lot. But, everyone at the end of the day has their own preferences, but those preferences can be encouraged, particularly when you're a young child, or they can be discouraged.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that might be boys are being discouraged or signaled that certain types of texts are not for them, whereas maybe girls are being signaled that actually the world is your oyster kind of thing, and you can draw upon a lot more types of
Yeah.
texts.
And I think I'd also just like to stress, so the work that we did, it shows that there's a lot of variation among boys and a lot of variation among girls as well. And even research which shows, I've published a number of papers on like sex differences or gender differences, but actually statistically there's more similarity and overlap than there is difference as well. So we can also be overly concerned. It's a consistent difference, to be honest, that there are differences between boys and girls. Girls enjoy reading more, they read more often as well, but there is also a lot of variation in terms of that, and I definitely wouldn't want to amplify sort of these gendered perceptions that we might have about reading. But I do think the point that I've made is maybe one that we're not open to discussing enough, and I do think it's maybe something that needs to be said or thought about at least a little bit, even just critically reflected upon.
Absolutely agree. No, and thank you for that really important addendum. I think it's the same across a lot of like research domains, is that there's always more similarities than differences between genders or different sexes. So there's no more questions in the chat at the minute. Obviously, if you have questions, please pop them in. I think this does actually segue quite nicely into a question that I had, which was again, going back to this idea of choosing reading materials and what kind of materials that we should be kind of encouraging children to read. So thinking of teachers again, there's a lot of nuance to choosing like appropriate materials in an instructional context, and this could be something that teachers struggle with. What books should I recommend, or what books do I recommend? In terms of what we've been sort of trying to communicate in our sort of materials so far, is that I think it's fair to say that you shouldn't discourage a child from reading if they want to read, so even if a text is likely to be maybe a little bit too difficult for them, then let them have a go. But then it is a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if a text is too difficult, it might obviously put them off from trying again in the future. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and sort of recommending material and pitching that challenge correctly.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So I think I know there's been a lot of work around sort of developing teachers' knowledge of children's literature so that they're able to support children to find texts that they're going to enjoy. But I think my research is maybe slightly different in that I think that we need to be better at empowering children and young people with the knowledge, skills and strategies that they need to choose their own text. And I guess I'm thinking about it within the context of like volitional reading, so their own reading that they might do either in class or outside of class as well. So one of the first things that we get children to think about is like, what sort of like experience are you looking for from a book? So recognizing that books offer lots of different types of experiences. What sort of book are you in the mood for? And then looking at things such as the the front cover, the book length, the blurb, all of the familiarity with book series, authors, etc., etc. But we know that very often when a child reads like the blurb on the back, it maybe sounds exciting, but actually the author's writing style or maybe the complexity of it is too much. And so encouraging them to read 2 or 3 pages before they choose a book, and also recognizing when a book isn't right and just being more confident at swapping and not necessarily having to persevere, because when children sometimes feel stuck with a book that they're not enjoying, all that's doing is sort of reinforcing the idea that reading's not for them and it's not something that they enjoy. So I think we need to be more proactive at encouraging children to choose a different book instead. And then I also think children can be really good at recommending books to each other, and we need to have more of that sort of structured kind of peer-to-peer support and input as well. So with the choice principle, we've sort of set out some different strategies that teachers can support children with so that they do have more skills and knowledge to be able to choose books.
Yes, absolutely. I think what you said there, like having the awareness or the courage even to just put a book down, because I experienced this as well, where you buy a book, you think it looks great, you start reading it, oh no, I'm not enjoying it, so you kind of have to put that investment that you've had in it aside and kind of just know to move on to something else. So just to flag, we've got about 5 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions which will fill the time, but if anybody does have any last minute questions, do pop them in the chat or pop your hand up. So I guess just to take this a step further a little bit, I was really interested in what you said about affective engagement, and particularly that affective experiences actually don't need to be positive to be meaningful and to help learners. And I guess it interested me because it made me think of some of the texts I've read in the past, and where the message or the content might be a little bit upsetting or difficult, but it actually makes me reflect and think about things, and through that sort of internalization process like you talked about, I learn something. And I just wondered, again, maybe this is a bit of a difficult topic, but there's that inclination to try and sort of dissuade children from reading about difficult things. And yeah, I guess I just wondered if you could say a little bit of your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I think this is the nature of reading is that it just offers a wide range of emotional experiences when we're sort of transported or immersed into the book as well. And so there's a concept, emodiversity, which I've recently come across, and it's this idea that actually a broad range of emotional experiences is what's really needed for us to feel well as individuals. And so it's not just about having these positive experiences. I would say of the work that we've done with children and young people, it tends to be the young people, so the teenagers, who are more open to and actually more proactively seeking some of these more meaning-making feelings, where maybe, for example, we've done work with neurodivergent young people where they talk about feelings of like kind of comfort when maybe a character's had a difficult experience of something that they shared with them, and that actually that's been something that's been really positive to them. So often these negative emotions can be transferred into more kind of positive meaning making things. And then also some people quite enjoy this experience of like fear or like unsettling emotions or like sadness, like experiencing sadness and then that kind of relaxation after. So there's a lot of kind of individual differences or variation in terms of what we're looking for from the books that we read. But for some of them, certainly that kind of wider range of emotional experiences is particularly beneficial, but maybe more so for teenagers than for children.
Yes, it's like catharsis, I suppose, what you're
Yeah.
talking about there.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question, and I hope it's not too difficult to finish on. But the way you talked about the role of reading in developing children's knowledge of the world and their culture, their connection to their culture. And, Wales and Scotland obviously both have this really strong cultural heritage, that gets communicated through texts. And, I'm not super familiar with the Scottish context, but I just wondered if from your experiences you had any insights on that kind of cultural or sort of bilingual learning context
Mhm.
and reading for pleasure that you could share.
Yeah, I think that so some of the young people, when children and young people see like there's a lot of research around the connection to characters, but actually quite a lot of them spoke about connection to settings and place as well, and actually seeing places that were familiar to them or environments that were familiar to them, seeing those reflected in books were really important. And then we also know children and young people like seeing their own languages reflected as well, and that's not necessarily just a language, but also like a way of speaking or like saying things as well. Just that kind of internal recognition, like I know what that is. I think that can be really important too. And we have another project called the Writing Lives of Children and Young People, which is about motivating and engaging children and young people as writers, so that they're writing stories that really reflect their own lives and experiences and identities. And we need to see a lot more of that, of kind of nurturing the next generation of writers, so that we have, people writing the kinds of books that we want to see.
That's such a lovely point to finish on. Thank you so much, Sarah. Um, I don't have enough words, honestly, to say how good and how ironically, I guess, engaging that was. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone who came. I hope that
Yeah,
everyone
thank
who
you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I hope that everyone who tunes in online enjoys as well. So this is the last of our summer talks. Just to let you know, we are aiming to do 2 talks per term. So we will see you back in autumn 2026 for the next talk. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks again for the invitation. Nice to see you all.